Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I am going through my 2020 reading statistics. So this is going to be the last video in everything that's kind of wrapping up 2020, and this is quite obviously my statistics. Now I do have a spreadsheet where I track my statistics and you guys have asked me to share it multiple times. However, I do not feel comfortable doing that because there is not really a single part of my spreadsheet that is mine. Every year I troll through all of the new spreadsheets that have been made. There is a new 2021 spreadsheet from Ali from Hardback Hoarder. There is also a new version of Corepile, which is the rating system that I use, created by G at Book Roast. And I will link both of those in my description box because my spreadsheet is just bits of everybody else's spreadsheets that I've tailored to suit my personal needs, and there's nothing stopping you guys from doing the same if you just have like a little bit of basic Google Sheets knowledge. I didn't know very much. If I want to change something in my spreadsheet, I literally just Google how to do it. It's not professional in any means. It's not even polished. I never delete things that I'm actually not using. Now that we're at the beginning of the year, I'm going through it again and taking out things that I don't use, adding things that I want to use, but it is by no means a polished product and it is not something that I would feel comfortable sharing when it is just not suitable for use, really, because there's just so much pointless stuff in there that I haven't taken out. But if you are looking for a spreadsheet, I will link Ali's 2019 spreadsheet is the basis of mine. I've also added a page from her 2020 spreadsheet. I've yet to go through her 2021 spreadsheet, and then I have taken Corepile out of G's spreadsheet and spliced it into the one that I already have, so I have that resource as well. So this video is just going to be running through my statistics. It's not going to be really informative to you guys at all. It is literally just statistics that I've gathered from the books that I've read in 2020. I really like statistics. I really like data and data analysis. Real boring stuff, but it absolutely fascinates me. I was the same when I was in school doing maths. I loved statistics. I also really loved algebra as well. There's just something about the problem solving nature of that that really appealed to me. And I have also compared the statistics to my 2019 statistics. So if there is any relevant increases or decreases based on last year, I will also share that with you so that we can actually learn something about my reading, learn how I am evolving and changing and growing. And if you're a new subscriber, maybe the new direction that my reading is heading in, as I do seem to change and evolve my reading every single year, will help you to decide whether my channel is the right one for you. Just gonna shuffle over a bit because I never leave myself enough space over here for all of my graphs and stuff. But we are just going to be starting off with something simple, and that is my Goodreads goal. My Goodreads goal for 2020 was 101 books. Every year I set my goal to one more than I read the year previous, and in 2020 I did manage to complete my goal. I read 107 books in total. However, there is going to be a discrepancy between this 107 and the number that the statistics in my spreadsheet relate to, because there are a couple of compendiums that are on my Goodreads currently reading, like the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin and the first 3 books in the Oz series by L. Frank Baum. I have tracked those books in my spreadsheet as separate books so that I could talk about them to you guys for wrap-ups and things, but in terms of actually reading the physical book, I haven't completed it yet, so it's not tracked on Goodreads, but it is on my spreadsheet. So my spreadsheet has me down as 111 books read, and the discrepancy there is the first 3 books in the Books of Earthsea and the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. 2020 was the first year that I read more than 40,000 pages. In total, I read 41,862 pages, which is 4,537 pages more than I read in 2019. I read a whole ton of big books in 2020. You guys know throughout the end of the year I was flip-flopping between Sanderson, especially the Stormlight Archives, and Robin Hobb, and all of those books are very, very large, even though Stormlight is split into 2 books in the editions that I read. But in terms of average books, so how many pages per book I read on average, in 2019 the average book length was 373, and in 2020 the average book length was 391. Now I'm a little bit shocked that my average book length is under 400, because I just feel like the majority of books I read are over 400 pages, and it is only the odd one, like the odd graphic novel, that is like under 200. So the first graph we are going to be getting into is my books by type. Now, as I was saying at at the beginning of this video, there are sections of my spreadsheet that I still have not removed that I don't use. This is a perfect example because this has arcs as a book by type. However, I don't use this section to track arcs. I track arcs in the format section, which is coming later. So this is pretty much split into 3 sections. We have series, we have standalones, and we have rereads. It comes as a surprise to no one that 73% of the books that I've read this year were books in a series, with only 24% being standalones, and I only reread 3 books this year, and that has stayed the same since I made the mid-year check-in version of this video. I haven't reread anything else, which is really strange for me because I do tend to reread quite a lot, but usually when I'm preparing for an anticipated release. And currently at this moment, aside from Crescent City, which was only released in 2020, all of my favorite series are done and concluded, so there's nothing that I'm really preparing for. I have always been a series reader. I'm also predominantly a fantasy reader, so that goes hand in hand with reading series. So anything between like 70 and 80% of books in a series is normal for me with this statistic. Next up, we have my books per month. So this is the amount of books I've read every single month. As you can see, we had 2 peaks here. The first one was in April, and that was for the Owl's Magical Readathon hosted by G at Book Roast, which I don't think is going to be happening this year. There may be something different, there may not, but I loved that readathon and I always went hard for that readathon. But what that results in is a dip because I can't read a lot in one month and then continue that. Like, I always dip a little bit. But then in July we also had a peak where I read 14 books. Something else that is worth noting throughout all of this is that I consistently managed to read at least 8 books per month every single month, aside from December where I really dropped the ball. But there was like a whole week in December where I pretty much read nothing, so it's unsurprising that I didn't make it. Next up, we have my ratings for the year. As you can see, I have significantly more 4-star ratings than any other rating. This is very different from 2019 where the majority of my ratings were 5 stars. Now, as I have already mentioned, I use the core pile system created by G at Book Roast. This is just a tribute to G, and what that involves is breaking a book down into its individual components and giving each component a rating out of 10. So you have character, atmosphere, world, plot, intrigue, logic, and enjoyment. So I really wanted to use this because I was pretty much just going with my gut and being like 5 stars to everything, but that was not reflective of books that I would actually say are my favorite. So I wanted a better way of rating, and G created Core Pile, which honestly has just made 2020 so much better in terms of rating. I definitely feel like everything is a little bit more accurate. Throughout the end of the year, I was enjoying the majority of what I was reading, so it's no surprise that we have 52 4 stars for the year. That is almost exactly half of the books that I read. 28 of the books I read I gave 5 stars, 25 I gave 3 stars, so 5 and 3 stars are pretty on par there. And then we only had 4 2-star ratings and 2 1-star ratings, which is great. I don't often have a whole ton of 1 or 2 stars because a lot of the books that I read and I don't love, I kind of just acknowledge and accept that it's not necessarily that it's a bad book, it is just my personal tastes aren't like super gelling with it. Moving on to demographics, this is always an interesting one because as the years have been going on with me having a booktube channel, I have been moving away from young adult considerably and diving into adult more, and it's come to the point where choosing adult over young adult is not even a conscious effort that I ever have to make. Like the majority, I think there's 1 book on my January TBR that is young adult, and I'm not even sure if it is because it takes place in a sorority, so I would class it as new adult, but I'm kind of waiting until I've read the book to make that judgment. But in 2020, 41% of the books that I read were adult, 39 were young adult, 12 were new adult, and 8% were middle grade. Now, if we directly compare this to last year, it seems like I've actually dropped the ball on reading adult because we have a 10% decrease on last year. My aim with this chart is to have it around 50-50 between young adult and adult. Obviously, that does not account for middle grade and new adult, but my overall goal is just to have the young adult and the adult balanced. So while it seems like I haven't quite achieved that, and it also seems like I haven't been reading much adult, something we have to take into account here is that in the year of 2019 I did not read a single new adult book, and this year I read 13 of them. So if we split this, instead of splitting it into young adult and adult, if we split it into like older demographics and younger demographics, what we actually have is 53% going to adult and new adult and 47% going to young adult and middle grade, which is pretty much much where I want it to be. I have also read slightly less young adult than I read in 2019 as well, as there is a 2% decrease on that this year, while middle grade has pretty much stayed exactly the same. There is like a percentage difference. We have also seen quite a bit of change in my formats wheel. So this is the category where I actually track arcs. I am going to be adding an extra format this year as well, which will be e-arcs. So arcs will be physical copies and e-arcs will be anything from NetGalley, because I have actually been using NetGalley quite frequently as well. So in 2020 I read 14% less physical books than I read the year previous, and the reason for this is that I read 12% more ebooks and 6% more arcs. Now I have been shifting more towards reviewing advanced copies, review copies and things like that, some of which do come in digital format, some come in physical format, so this does detract away from the percentage of physical books I'm reading. I have also been reading a lot of self-published books in 2020 as well, which you will see when we get to the publishing section of this video. And the thing about self-published books typically is not only are they significantly cheaper if you buy the ebook, they are also extremely inexpensive if you buy the ebook. So I have been going down that route. I have, as I mentioned, also had things like e-arcs, and I do have a subscription to Scribd, and I do also now have a subscription to Kindle Unlimited as well, and all of that also falls into the ebook category. Moving on to the genres, I'm not going to go through this entire thing because there are quite a few genres on here, but the main one of course is fantasy. I've already mentioned I'm predominantly a fantasy reader, but we do have a 10% increase on fantasy in 2020. My aim with this one generally is to always have fantasy at around or over 50%, just because the majority of books I do read are fantasy. However, I do like to read other things as well. Sci-fi is pretty much the same as it was the year before, and I have been reading a lot of fantasy romance, which I have been categorizing as fantasy. However, going forward into 2021, I have made that its own genre. I don't usually overly track subgenres, but just because I do read so much fantasy romance at the moment, I want to see what percentage of my overall reading that is representing. You can definitely see I've been shifting more towards romance in general in 2020, as we have a 5% increase on last year. I don't think I read any solely romance books in 2019, and contemporary, like science fiction, is pretty much exactly the same as it was the year before. Contemporary was also my second biggest slice in 2019, as it is in 2020. Now we're moving on to the sources. These are the places where I am acquiring the books that I'm reading, and this is the chart that needs the most work, because what I am seeing is that I have read 14% less books from my own TBR than I did in 2019, and that is not good. Only 41 of the 107 books I read I owned before the start of 2020. So what this is telling me is that I am not prioritizing the books that I already own. I did own the majority of the books that I read. However, the hold section in this chart represents books that I have purchased or acquired in the year that the statistics represent. So there has been an 11% increase on this section in 2020 over 2019, and 43 of the books that I read in the year are ones that I had purchased or acquired in that year. And I really want to be focusing on my backlist. 2021 for me is going to be focusing on not necessarily backlist books, but my personal backlist. So the majority of them will have been published before 2021, which does make them backlist, but just the things that I've owned for ages, the things that I've owned pre-2021, because what is the point in owning them if I'm not going to prioritize them? So that is something that is definitely at the forefront of my mind, as well as finishing series. A lot of the books in those series I do already own. I just need to prioritize picking them up and stop prioritizing new books. Another difference that we have here in comparison to 2019 is that arcs represent 17% of the books that I've read. So books that I've received from publishers and authors come under pub, and NetGalley is also a way that you can acquire arcs, e-arcs to read, and that makes up 17%. And prior to 2020, nobody would give me any ARCs. I requested them quite frequently, but I was very rarely approved. So I have actually been approved for ARCs in 2020, and I have been reading those, which has made a significant difference to this table. Next, we see whether I've been reading the books on my TBR. So I use the TBR page on my spreadsheet exclusively to track Bookopoly books and also books for read-alongs that I'm hosting. So if you've seen a TBR where I've had 5 Bookopoly rolls and then randomly added 5 books, those extra 5 books will not have been accounted for in this table. But in 2020, I added 90 books to my TBR and I read 83 of them. So there was only 7 books I put on my TBR throughout the year that I did not read, which is a big change from 2019, where I think I put 94 books on my TBR and I only read 73. So there were 21 books there that I just didn't read. Next up, we have the diversity that I'm seeing. So the biggest section of this chart represents multiple forms of diversity. So for example, we may have an LGBT plus character and also disabled characters. And I read 35 books with multiple forms of diversity. Surprisingly, the next biggest section is books that contain racial diversity, which was 31 books, which accounts for 28% overall. In 2019, the section of books with no diversity was my biggest, which seems more extreme than it actually is, because in reality, everything else apart from that section on this chart means that a book did contain some element of diversity. But this year, there were only 21 books that I read that did not contain any diversity at all, which is a 9% decrease on 2019, which is what we like to see. And as well as that, that 9% has been directly accounted for with the increase in racial diversity, which is 9% more than it was in 2019. I will say that I do want to figure out a way to track whether a book is own voices in my spreadsheet, because I do think that that is definitely an area that I'm falling flat on. However, I don't like to dig into authors' personal lives to figure out whether they're representing elements of their own identity in a book. Like, fair enough if the author is open about whether their book is own voices, but I'm not entirely sure how I could ever have an accurate statistic for this when I personally don't feel comfortable deep diving for information that is not immediately obvious and disclosed by the author. In terms of authors, I do like to track whether the authors of the books I'm reading are authors I've read from before, whether they're new to me, or whether they are debuts. Now, the debut section is always small. I've read 6 debut books this year, and that is because, as you are going to find out when we go through my anticipated releases in my next video, I don't pay all that much attention to new releases unless I've seen like an ARC circulating or you guys have recommended it to me, or if it's a new release in a series I've already started and I'm really excited about, or a book by one of my favorite authors. So I have only read 6 debut novels in 2020. I actually don't see that changing. I don't know whether it's a bad thing that I'm not reading debuts, because debuts struggle more because they don't have an established fan base, but it's never something that I felt like prioritizing or gone out of my way to prioritize, and it's not something that I'm necessarily interested in prioritizing. I do want to support new authors and help them reach a wider audience, but as you can tell from this graph, I definitely enjoy reading authors that I'm more familiar with a lot more. And the reason for that is that I am a little bit of a completionist. If you saw my series video, you may not think that, but if I enjoy a book by an author, I want to read everything they've written because I like to be knowledgeable about what I'm talking about, I guess. So if I'm telling you you should read an author, I want to be able to highlight the best book, the worst book, the books that are in the middle, the books that will have themes that you personally enjoy, so that I can get you interested in that author as well, if that makes sense. And that is definitely reflected here with authors that I've previously read from accounting for 61% of my reading overall. That number is also an 8% increase on last year. We also have a 5% decrease on the new category in this section, because obviously I'm reading more from authors that I've known. And what we're also finding is I think that the known section is just going to continue to grow, because every time I read a new to me author I enjoy, they then move straight away into the known section. So if I read the entire Wheel of Time series, for example, in 2021, only the first book, Eye of the World, would go into the new category, because after that I'm familiar with Robert Jordan, and every other book I read in that series will end up going into the known category. So I do foresee known continuing to grow and the other sections continuing to decrease. And then the final section we're going to be going through today is publishers, and I am definitely not going through this entire wheel because there is a lot. In 2019, I separated everything into parent companies, so I didn't break it down into the individual subsidiaries. However, what I was finding with that is that it wasn't completely accurate because I think HarperCollins was my biggest publishing house last year, and as you can see this year I've only actually read 5 books that were published by HarperCollins. Now this seems like I've just read significantly less from that publishing house, but the actual truth of it is that in 2019 I wasn't reading HarperCollins books, I was reading Harper Voyager books, and you can see I'm still doing that this year. Voyager is joint second as the publishing house that I read the most from, accounting for 11 books that I read throughout the year. The other publisher that this is tied with is Goodreads, and what you will notice about both of those is that they are big fantasy publishing houses, especially in the UK. The majority of fantasy books are published by Goodreads, Harper Voyager or Titan Books. But the great thing about this chart, the only thing that I can really analyze, is that the biggest section here is self-published books. I've gotten really into supporting indie authors, and that is something that makes me feel less bad about not necessarily supporting debuts as much because I'm supporting indies instead. Now I will admit that at the moment the majority of indie books I've read have been from more popular authors like Jennifer L. Armentrout, Colleen Hoover's got some indie books. We also have Laura Thalassa, who is an incredibly popular fantasy romance indie author. But I do also have quite a few books now that are lesser known by indies that I'm hoping to read throughout 2021 and beyond and recommend to you guys, providing that I like them. I have really fallen into indie books this year, particularly because I've discovered my love for fantasy romance, new adult romance in general, a little bit of urban fantasy and low fantasy in there as well. And I do truly believe that the publishing industry is dropping the ball on fantasy romance. It is not something that we see widely available and highly marketed. They don't have the big marketing budgets for these books, if they are releasing them at all, outside of Sarah J Maas, who they don't even market as fantasy romance. They market her as fantasy, which does her a disservice because then you are bringing readers to her book who don't like romance and will rate the book low because it has romance in it when it should have just been advertised as that from the beginning. Rant aside, I think that if you are a fan of fantasy romance or romance in general, and also other genres as well, because there's a ton of indie books out there, but particularly fantasy romance and romance, you should definitely be checking out indie books. And I know Goodreads is terrible for things like this, but there are lists out there. Like if you search on Goodreads best fantasy romance, the majority are indie. So even though the pool of indie books is vast and it may be hard to navigate, you can go to places like Goodreads to find out where you should start and find some books that may be interesting to you. And also, just while we're on this note, a lot of you guys have been asking me to make a fantasy romance and indie fantasy romance recommendations video. That is coming. I haven't forgotten. It's definitely something that I am going to be making soon. But that just about covers my 2020 reading statistics. I know that this isn't really a video that is particularly helpful to you guys. It is pretty much exclusively documentative, but I hope you have enjoyed this video regardless. Please let me know down in the comments whether you have. I make 2 of these videos a year, one at the mid-year point and one at the beginning of the following year, taking a look at the year previous. But aside from that, I do hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please don't forget to like if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.